we're going to hand the stage over to our explorers, innovators. And before that, I would like to give you a little word of warning or advice. And I think what happens is, especially, we have clubbed them all together and they are going to share a stage. And I think it's quite easy for us to think of each of their practices going together as a style or a thought or a school of thought. But as much as there's a common thread of using technology or developing technique, each of them have very unique practices and very unique exploration and research. So it would be great if we start looking at them as individual practices and almost experiments in architecture that are definitely sort of striding the lines between art and architecture, definitely provoking us as a field, as a profession, as to what is it that we do, how is it that we can reimagine space. Because if you've read a little bit about all of them or people who've been working with digital technologies, very often there is a resistance to the word style or icon, which probably was something that we're very used to seeing in the world of architects. And this is, like I said, an exciting new breed that are not looking as such to become star architects, but are interestingly looking to collaborate, looking to sort of look at the edges of the field, and to even the risk of being called non-architects. So let's just, I'm going to obviously invite our first speaker of the evening, Alvin. Alvin Huang is the founder and design principal of Synthesis Design and Architecture. He's an award-winning architect, designer, and educator, and specializes in the application of material performance, emergent design, and digital fabrication. Alvin, I'm going to hand over the stage to you. Can we have a warm round of applause?
Thank you, everyone. It's my pleasure to be here tonight, or this afternoon. Big thank you to Sujit and Smaran for putting this together, and Deepti as well. Yep, it's my first time here in India, and it's been an amazing experience, and really excited to be here to share my work with you and collaborate with some amazingly talented people and students. And it's really been a great experience, and really a fantastic place. So the title of my talk is Technology is the Answer, but What is the Question? This is actually the title of a talk that Cedric Price gave in 1964 at the AA in London. And I think it's a really apt title in terms of, I think a lot of people within the digital realm tend to focus on technology as both question and answer. And I think it's also interesting to present it in the context of sort of the statement that was just made by the Indian Institute of Architects as saying that their upcoming conference is going to be about questions rather than statements. And I think technology is something that we can use to help the work that we do, but more than help, I think it's more than a tool. I think it's actually an instrument. And I used this analogy the other night when speaking with someone about how we use technology. And I think a tool like a hammer allows you to kind of execute something and produce something that helps you do something better, faster, more efficient. But it, in the end, is about automating. Whereas an instrument, like a saxophone, is something which allows you to do things that you're unable to do without it. And like the instrument, the saxophone, technology is something that is able to be something that we're able to not only think with, but create with. And I think that's really what this talk is about. Good friend of mine, Hanif Kara, and a colleague, is a fantastic structural engineer. And he told me this once. The best engineers provide great solutions. The best architects create great problems. So I'm hopefully going to present you with some great problems. The work that I do is really focused on this sort of overlapping territory between design practice and design research. I think design practice and design research are both two separate things that are explored in my office, and the territory we like to look at is where they overlap, this area called exploratory practice. The work we're doing in the office covers all scales, from large-scale buildings all the way down to objects, everything in between. And one of the questions we like to ask is, can architecture be more than buildings? And there's a long history of this. I think if you look at the great modernists and the way that chairs and furniture and artifacts have often been used as sort of prototypes for architectural ideas, we look at furniture and objects as prototypes for visionary architecture. And one of the big questions we ask is, can design be a form of research? We have four main topics that we're exploring: geometric logic, informed form, performative patterning, and digital craft. I'll get into a little bit more detail about each of those topics as this talk moves on. Digital craft, we're looking at machinic processes, digital fabrication, and most importantly, craftsmanship. And I think craftsmanship is something that people tend to think gets lost in this idea of digital fabrication, but is absolutely, absolutely essential to thinking about digital fabrication. One of the things we're interested in is how we redefine craft in a post-digital era. By post-digital, I mean we're soon moving into an era where digital is something you don't have to define. We don't ever talk about the fact that we are sending emails. We're just sending. It doesn't matter that they're coming by the computer. It doesn't matter that they're coming by the phone. It's just the way that we communicate now. Soon we won't be making those distinctions about using a computer in design. We won't be using those distinctions to talk about making fabrication protocols through machines. What we see here are three different designs. One is for a chair, the other is a desk, the other is a pavilion. All three are done with different machinic processes. The chair is 3D printed, the desk and the pavilion are both CNC manufactured. And one of the things that really drives us is saying that, can fabrication be both a design input and a design output? So the way that we're making these things is not only a form of output, it's a form of input. We're taking them into account as the way that we are designing for those machines to manufacture. We're also really interested in the idea that materiality can be more than finish. Materiality is something that is inherently a performative property that we're looking to exploit in these projects. We're very, very interested in how three-dimensional conception can be described by three-dimensional documentation. One of the things that was really striking to me about, I guess, the contemporary mode or traditional mode of architectural practice is that we think of things and conceive of things in 3 dimensions. We describe them in 2 dimensions, hand those 2-dimensional descriptions to somebody else, and then ask for them to rebuild them in 3 dimensions. I'd equate that with me conceiving of a novel in English, writing it down in Spanish, and then handing it to you and asking you to read it back to me in English. There's a guaranteed loss of fidelity. So we're not there yet, but we are moving towards a paradigm where we don't have to have that loss of fidelity. Performative patterning is something else we're really interested in the office. This idea of a pattern that can be dynamic or responsive or visually engaging, where pattern is something that has always, always, always been a part of architecture, whether it is the pattern of brick, the pattern of a facade, or the pattern of any type of architectural element, because architecture is made of components. One of the things that we're really interested in is how these patterns become things that can be visually engaging and encourage people to see architecture in a way that is dynamic. This is 2 different projects that we're looking at. Field Formations is a public art installation in Los Angeles, California, and the Central Plaza Lampong facade in Lampong, Thailand. Both of them are patterns of visual engagement which are kind of activated by movement, and this idea that by moving around, the patterns appear to change even though they're static. In both cases, we're looking at a set of dynamic models that are driven by geometric relationships, where we're looking at how we can produce these effects by the manipulation of these models. What appears to have endless variation is actually, in both cases, exactly 6 modules. In the facade, we have 6 modules, and in the art installation, we have 6 modules. But through the rationalization of those from what was an infinite variation, we're able to turn them into something that has the efficiency of something that is mass-produced, but is able to have the complexity of something that is limitless variation. Another project that we're looking at pattern is a pattern that's informed by data. And this is an installation that we're doing right now for IBM Watson in San Francisco, California. And this is the showroom for their it's called Watson Experience Center. The Watson Experience Center is a place where they're showcasing their technology for Watson, which is a cognitive computing machine learning division of IBM. And so what we did here is we actually used Watson to do a deep dive and a data scan of the last 3 years of digital sales using mobile devices. And using those, we produced this, what you see is a sort of image map or a sort of graphic analysis of all of that data. And all of that data is then used to map against a pattern. And that pattern is then translated into a series of contours or a height field. And that height field is then driving another rationalization of the pattern, which shows up as 2 different overlaying conditions. Those 2 different overlaying conditions are mapped against one another, producing a moire effect. So we've got an outer panel and an inner panel, and as those 2 panels overlap one another, which you see here, this is a construction shot, just went up last week, so we're just wrapping this one up. You can see that the project starts to produce this kind of atmospheric effect, which produces an iconic backdrop for the Watson Experience Center, but also produces a narrative that their docents can come in, and the intensities that you see here are actually mapping this information. Right, so as you go across, you can see the horizontal band in the middle is actually the peak in sales during, we shifted it so the week actually begins on a Tuesday so that the weekend would show up in the middle. And then the vertical spikes you see are actually related to different days of the week. And so you can identify certain periods of the year where the sales increase, and all of these things are actually part of the narrative that Watson is able to use to sell their services. One of the things we're also really interested in is this idea called informed form, and that's thinking about form finding and funicular form, and thinking of material formants as a driver for thinking of form as something that is inherently driven by structural performance. This is definitely something that's highly inspired by the late, great Frei Otto, last year's Pritzker Prize winner. And his research here into kind of soap film structures is something that really inspired us. He's doing this through manual processes looking at the performative properties of soap films. And we're taking that into a digital capacity and beginning to see it as something that can be simulated through what's called dynamic mesh relaxation. And a lot of this comes from my own experience of having worked with Sujit actually in the and Mark as well, and Simon in the offices of Zaha Hadid pre-2008 in an era that I would call as a window of great architectural excess. A moment when just about anything in the world could be done as long as you threw enough money at it. Then we had 2008 and the world financial crash, and suddenly all of that money went away. And me, as someone who's deeply invested in form, found I really had to find ways to justify it. And one of the things I realized is if you look at, for example, Frank Gehry's Disney Concert Hall, if you had to value engineer that building, the form could be removed, but the structure would stay, and the structure had nothing to do with the form. However, if you look at Felix Candela's chapels, or if you look at Frei Otto's work, you could not value engineer the form out of the building. The form and the structure were the same thing. So we began looking at this in a series of installations, one which we did at University of Calgary with Jason Johnson, another one we did at the MoCA Shanghai, and in a series of architectural projects, a proposal for the Daegu Library in South Korea and the Fuzhou Cross-Strait Cultural Center in China. But the project that probably best exemplifies this in terms of my work is something we did for Volvo. And the Volvo V60 electric plug-in car here was focused on as a design competition hosted by Volvo. And that competition had about 250 entries from around the world. Those 250 entries, which you see a few of here, all had very similar properties, which are almost all of them looked at the pavilion as something that was a destination, something that the car would drive to. The question we were asking was, can architecture be an accessory rather than a destination? So basically, could we think of the pavilion as something that could actually flat pack and fit inside the car? Hopefully this video plays. And it's playing. Okay, so I'm not going to talk, I'll let the video do the talking.
In spring of 2013, Volvo Italia and the Plan magazine launched the Switch to Pure Volvo Open Architecture Contest to showcase the new Volvo V60 plug-in diesel hybrid at undercover trade shows and open-air venues in Italy's public squares, attracting over 150 entries from around the world. The winning entry was the Pure Tension Pavilion by Synthesis Design and Architecture. The entire pavilion assembles and demounts in less than 1 hour and fits in the trunk of the car.
The Switch to Pure Volvo competition organized by the Plan and behalf of Volvo was interesting to us in terms of the kind of questions and challenges that it raised.
They required that the structure is something that was easily assemblable, easily dismountable, and could travel with the car, and was an iconic structure that could really showcase the car. We saw this as the perfect opportunity to apply some of the research we've been doing into dynamic mesh relaxation and thinking about how we can look at fabric structure in terms of thinking of something that's lightweight, portable, and easily collapsible. So the original idea of this was that the structure would wrap up and bundle into like a little package, like a laundry hamper, and just kind of pop open, which would have put us well out of budget. So we ended up moving towards a CNC bent aluminum frame, so it is slightly outside of the final shape it's going to take, but it gets tensioned into position by the skin.
On my spare time, I like to go backpacking, camping. So a lot of the stretch fabric aspects of it was something that actually was very attractive to me because it's something I was so familiar with, that lightness and efficiency. And also the elegance that the combination of the simplicity and sophistication conveys.
We took that a step further and began thinking about it as a charging station for the car.
We wanted it to actually be integrated into the whole structure, that it's not just a plug-in interface with the power, but it actually produces its own power.
So when we saw this design, obviously, there were a lot of things that we saw that fit together.
After the winning of the competition, we went through a process of rationalizing the geometry to make it more buildable. Worked very closely with our structural engineers, Bureau Happelt, which are based here in Los Angeles and Culver City. And then we started working with Fabric Images, who are based in Chicago.
The design idea behind it is this idea of pure tension. We weren't sure how we were going to do it, but we started, and we started figuring out what worked and what didn't.
Where we're at right now with the frame is that we have through bolt connections. The next step is to drill out and countersink all the connections for sex bolts, so it'd be flush connection, so there'd be nothing protruding.
And eventually, between the seamstresses, between our CAD guys, between myself, we figured out how to do it.
Ascent Solar provides us with these, which are flexible photovoltaic panels. So unlike normal photovoltaic panels, which are extremely rigid and extremely heavy, these are extremely light and flexible.
Because of that constraint, we had to choose a lightweight, 70% open mesh. And what's interesting about mesh relaxation techniques is they use the natural qualities of the material to create a shape. What's interesting about this structure is it takes the natural qualities of the Volvo and lets that inform the formal qualities of the structure itself.
The entire pavilion, in terms of the skin, fits into a small box, whereas the perimeter frame, because it is a kind of slip-fit tube, like a tent, T-mounts and will fit into the trunk of the Volvo.
There is a positive side in that it will provide solar energy, but there's a negative side in that it heats the car. And just cooling the car to a comfortable temperature requires a lot of energy. So anything that could reduce the solar heating of the car while also providing the electricity that the car wants is a win-win situation. And also to do it in such an efficient way and in such a beautiful way. That is, was something that our innovation team always looks for, and it was great that, even though we had not found it ourselves, that we could support the innovation process that could enhance our products and hopefully enhance the world at large.
The interrelationship of our structure and the car is something that kind of drew attention to the car and also allowed you to experience the car in a new way. I think what's really surprised me in this journey of producing this pavilion and winning this competition has been just how forward-thinking Volvo has been in terms of engaging us as designers and giving us the freedom to do what we're interested in and really pushing the limits of what our fabricators are able to do. And they've been very supportive of that and engaged with us in the entire design process in terms of producing something that we think is really an amazing concept that we hope can be applied towards future products and future opportunities.
So this project actually, in the end, we were able to deliver the project and really ask the question, can sustainability be sexy? And I think something that happens with sustainability is we oftentimes think of it as utilitarian. In this case, the iconic form is performative, but it also is, as you can see, hopefully see, is sexy and something that I think helps bring a lot of attention towards the ideas behind it. But one of the other things is that it became super portable. So in this case, the pavilion was able to travel with the car. It flat packs and fits inside the trunk of the car, charges the car in about assembles in 45 minutes, and charges the car in about 8 hours. The final topic that the office looks at is this idea of geometric logic and basically thinking about associative relationships in variable geometries and thinking about ideas about mass customization. These ideas are not new. Relationships in geometry are not new, but what computation allows us to do is establish a much more complex set of relationships and be able to have more control and also more experimentation to discover emerging properties of these relationships. One of the things that we also deal with is the fact that we work a lot in Asia, and the project you see here is a shopping center we did in Bangkok, Thailand, and we hand over at the design development stage, and at the design development stage the local architect takes over. So one of the things that was really important for us was that we could define geometry by relationships rather than dimensions. As all of you know, in the construction phase, a lot of things start moving and changes start happening on site. And so if we could define things by relationships, then as those things start changing, the local architects have a better understanding of what we're trying to achieve if we define things by relationship rather than by dimension. Forgot to mention that the project on the right is a competition proposal we did for the Guggenheim Helsinki competition in Finland. Both projects sit in very different sites, and a lot of the relationships are about their context. In the case of the Central World, it's related towards the existing Central World Shopping Center, and in the case of the Helsinki project, it's related very much towards its oceanfront site and relationship to the park and city center. In the case of it's playing. So in the case of the Central World, we're looking at a set of kind of manipulatable live models, which we actually sat down with the developer and with our client, and we're able to real-time manipulate and come back to drive a Excel chart, which is, they were actually able to see the effect that our changes had on their returns on investment. What you see on the right is our diagrams for the Guggenheim, where we're beginning to look at how the kind of relationships between circulation and views and those things relate towards the dissemination of this floating volume of the museum floating above the public areas of the site. In both cases, we get a volume of architecture. On the left, we have one which is driven by an internal courtyard or exposed outdoor courtyard, and on the right, a sort of internal atrium. The facade of the Central World is sort of mapping the relationships of the intensities of Planchet Road, which is the most intense retail thoroughfare in Bangkok. Some of you might be familiar with it. Really, really intense, probably not dissimilar to some of the traffic we see out here. And we're mapping that through a series of kind of perforated backlit aluminum panels. And then on the Guggenheim Helsinki, we're trying to reference the graphic patterns of the Finnish sweaters and using a variable pattern to define different porosities in reinforced concrete panels. In both cases, we get a kind of relationship that allows us to read the facade as something that appears to be dynamic, even though it's static, and has a kind of effect of movement that allows us to kind of embed this dynamic into the architecture. In the interior spaces in the Central World Shopping Center, we're looking at using timber to kind of create a sense of warmth, but also using the timber with a series of embedded pathways, which you see in the kind of CNC milled ceilings to articulate different flows of travel. In the case of the Guggenheim Helsinki, we have a series of twisting overhead roof lights which open up as they move towards a northbound orientation. And then you get the kind of twisting atrium view from the public lobby up to the paid gallery spaces. And here you have some of the shots of how the building sits in Bangkok, and then how the other one sits on the ocean front in Helsinki. All of these projects are produced with digital tools, but one of the things I'm very adamant about is that they are not what I would call digital architecture. The image that's here is what was known as the first car, but at that time it was not called a car, it was called a horseless carriage. Fast forward 100-something years later, nobody remembers that a horse was ever involved. So I think one of the things that I'm really, really intent on is that the fact that what I do is not digital architecture, it's architecture. We don't need the prefix of digital. It's something that is, I think, not going to be remembered. Some of you may remember what it was like for me. I graduated from my undergraduate degree in 1998. And at that time, the big conversation with me and my colleagues in Los Angeles was, are you going to go to a CAD office or a normal office? And that's something that you could not say anymore. And I think today we view these digital tools as something that are novel and that are unique. I think in 20 years, they will be par for the course and very, very much a way of thinking rather than a way of automating. But in the end, I think what I'm most interested is actually with the fundamentals of architecture. And this quote from Dion Dodari, I think, says it all. It's about the density of material, the pleasure of geometry, and the sensuality of everything. Thank you.